Thank you all for joining us. As I said, I'm Brianna Walker. I'm with the Union County Wildlife Chapter. And this evening, we will be discussing tundra swans. Our guest speaker tonight is Stephen Warner. He is a visitor services specialist and education program coordinator for the United States Fish and Wildlife, who facilitates educational and outreach programs for both the Alligator River and Pea Island National Wildlife Refuges. He has served in a variety of education and instruction positions, from being an instructor for the Coast Guard to being an education specialist at the Nauticus Naval Museum in Norfolk, Virginia. Stephen strives to help people have rewarding experiences with wildlife and the outdoors, and tonight he is going to give us a rewarding experience on swans. And I'm very excited about this presentation because I was actually lucky enough to go see the tundra swans last year, so I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Stephen, for doing this presentation for our group, and I will just turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Brianna. Okay, my name is Steve Warner from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm the Education Programs Coordinator here at Alligator River and Pea Island National Wildlife Refuges in eastern North Carolina. This evening, I'm here to talk to you about tundra swans. I'll give you a brief overview of their identification, appearance, size, characteristics. We'll also talk about their habitat, summer range and breeding grounds, their winter range, migration routes. I'll also cover feeding and breeding behaviors, and finally, I'll touch on some of the conservation efforts that we do here at our refuges for the swans. So their Cygnus columbianus is tundra swans, and here's some tundra swans in flight. I've got a little video here that's going to show, and I'll talk to you about some characteristics while the video is running. Okay, so what do swans look like? There it goes. Okay, well, they're very large birds. They have an entirely white plumage, but sometimes it gets stained by the watercolor or the contents in the water. It'll usually be stained a dark brown or a rust color, depending on what type of water in. The sexes are identical. They look the same, but the males are just a little bit bigger than the females. They have the characteristic swan, very long neck. However, by swan standards, it's not the longest neck of the group. The bill and the lore are almost completely black, but they have a characteristic yellow spot right at the base. Their legs and feet are entirely black. Now, cygnets, after they hatch, have grayish down until fledging and pinkish gray legs and feet when they're hatched, and they get darker, and then after the first year, they go ahead and turn black like they're adults. As far as size, I said the males are slightly larger than the females, but their length is 47 to 57 inches. They're quite heavy birds. They average around 19 to 20 pounds, but they can weigh as much as 23 pounds. And because of all that weight, they have a very large wingspan. It's 5.5 to almost 6 feet. Go ahead and stop the video here, and we'll move on to some of the subspecies. All right, there's two major subspecies, the American or whistling swan, that's on the left, and the Bewick swan, which is in Asia. They winter in Asia and they summer in Asia and winter in Europe. The differences are, you can see it quite starkly here. The Bewick's has a much larger yellow spot, and the Bewick's is also a little bit smaller than the American swan. We're going to talk entirely about the American swan tonight. Okay, so let's talk about their range. In the orange area here, you can see that's the Arctic tundra in Alaska and northern Canada. That's how they get their name. The yellow areas that you see, those are their migration areas, and it's through Canada and northern United States. And then the light blue areas you see, those are their wintering grounds. And you can see there's two distinct groups. There's the eastern group, which migrates to the mid-Atlantic states. About 90% of them are there in either the Chesapeake Bay or North Carolina. And then there's the western population, and you can see their areas, but most of them are either in California in the San Joaquin Valley and Washington and Oregon in the lowlands there. And we'll cover that a little bit later on with the migration routes. But you see, I've highlighted a spot called Point Hope in Alaska, and that's the delineation line between the two populations. And it's really pretty stark. Almost none of the birds that are in one side migrate to the other. So all of the swans that are east and north of Point Hope migrate to the eastern U.S., and all of those south and west of Point Hope migrate to the west. So what is their habitat like? Well, this is their habitat in Alaska, their summer breeding grounds. It's can be described as wet meadow tundra. It's Arctic lakes, ponds, pools, and this you see here is probably a coastal delta area. Very few trees, a lot of grasses growing, and a lot of water for them to forage in. When they're migrating, this is North Dakota, they try and find something similar, shallow ponds, lakes, and riverine marshes, but you'll see them start using harvested agricultural fields and fields growing winter cereal grains for their time when they're in North Dakota. And once they reach their wintering grounds here in Pea Island, you can see that we have some ponds for them that we developed. They like shallow estuarine tidal areas, freshwater lakes and ponds. And again, due to habitat loss, they're increasingly using agricultural fields for foraging. Okay, let's talk about their migration routes. Now you can see that there's two distinct routes that they take. The eastern population, which is in purple or blue here, departs their summer grounds in late September. They'll make a stop in the upper Mississippi River and North Dakota area to feed and to rest. They'll do that in mid-October. Once they rest and feed, the remaining flight can be nonstop, about 1,600 miles to the mid-Atlantic area, and they'll begin to arrive at their winter grounds in mid-November. They'll remain at their winter grounds until late February, and large numbers of them will fly to a staging area in the Susquehanna River Valley of Pennsylvania. Then some of them will fly to the southern Ontario province of Canada near Lake St. Clair, and then they'll continue their flights on west of the Great Lakes back to North Dakota, and they'll begin arriving in their summer breeding grounds in May. I've got some audio of the Tundra swans. And remember I said that they are also called whistling swans. They get the name from whistling swans, not from their vocalizations, but they get it from a sound their wings make. Unfortunately, they are very loud birds and very vocal birds, even when they're flying. So I was unable to find any video of the actual whistling sounds. So everything you're going to hear is just their vocalization sounds that they make. And of note, it was Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition that first documented and called them whistling swans. Okay, so that was their sounds. You can see they do a variety of sounds and noises, and they do those in flight also. So let's move on to feeding and diet. In their summer range, they feed primarily on leaves, roots, rhizomes, and stems of aquatic plants and grasses. The cygnets and perhaps some adult males will take immature mosquitoes from the surface of some of the tundra pools. During migration, they will eat aquatic vegetation and pondweed. However, again, due to habitat loss, they're increasingly using agricultural waste grains, growing winter cereal grains, and they're even starting to dig up some small potatoes and sugar beets to forage on. Once they reach their winter grounds in the Atlantic or California, the swans will initially start to feed on below ground tubers and mollusks, especially in the Chesapeake Bay. They'll feed on clams and things, but by the end of winter, they'll start feeding roots, rhizomes, stems of aquatic plants, and grasses. The cygnets can sometimes take immature mosquitoes from the surface of tundra pools. When they're migrating, they will eat aquatic vegetation and pondweed. However, due to habitat loss, they're increasingly using agricultural waste grains, actual growing winter cereal grain crops, and they're even starting to dig up very small potatoes and sugar beets. Once they reach their winter grounds, swans will initially feed on the below ground tubers and mollusks, mostly clams in the Chesapeake Bay, but they'll switch to harvest grains and other grasses by the end of winter. Their long neck permits them to feed in water up to 3 feet deep, but not all of the immature swans can reach that deep. So the parents often bring food to the surface for the young by paddling and pushing the food up from the bottom up to the surface. When feeding on their small mollusks, they have a gizzard like a chicken does, full of dirt and gravel, and they put the mollusks in there and grind it up, and that's how they eat their mollusks. So let's go to flight. Here's some tundra swans in flight. During their summer grounds, they really only fly to and from the nest and their foraging sites, and also when they're chasing intruders from their territory. Takeoffs and landings can be a little bit difficult for them, but they accomplish it by using some process and some running steps. Landing on water is accomplished as a slide, and when they land on the ground, they have to do several running steps. During migration, flight is similar to that of other swan species and ducks and geese, the familiar V formation. Migrating flocks average around 100 swans, but they can get significantly larger. They usually comprise several family groups. They typically fly a few hundred feet high, but they can, if they need to, fly as high as 5,000 feet. Now, I've got a video next and it's in slow motion, of swans taking off, and it's a very good description of what they need to do to fly. It's not just take off and land. They really do have to go through a process. So let's go ahead and watch the video here. Here it goes. Eating. I couldn't resist this. Can everybody see this now? Can anybody see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So mating, tundra swans, like other swans, mate in late spring and soon after they have returned to their nesting grounds. And as usual, they are monogamous until one partner dies. Now, should one of the partners die, they may or may not go ahead and get another mate, and they may not mate again for the rest of their lives. They're very good mates. They have a very low divorce rate of about 2%. Okay, well, let's move on to nesting. The nesting season starts at the end of May. The pair build a large mound-shaped nest that you can see here on the picture from plant material at an elevated site near open water. They will defend a large territory around it, so these nests are not very close together. About 50% of them will use last year's nest. The other 50% have to build a new one, but they do come back to the same area year after year. The female may line the nest with some of her chest down and line the nest. The female lays and incubates a clutch of about 4 to 5 eggs, can be as many as 7. She lays her eggs at 1.5 to 2 day intervals. The pen, the female, incubates about 75% of the time, with the male incubating 25%. The male will go ahead and keep a steady eye lookout for potential predators heading towards the nest. And if they do come, he'll try to divert the predator away from the nest by using his wings to run faster and look bigger, but they will defend the nest fiercely if they need to. Here's some cygnets in the nest, and the eggs hatch in 30 to 32 days. The down is grayish white until they fledge. They're ready to leave the nest almost immediately after hatching and begin feeding on their own. They'll stay close with their parents for the entire first year until they return to the breeding grounds again next year. Since they nest in cold areas, the cygnets will grow quickly. They take about 60 to 75 days to fledge. However, when it is time to migrate, if they have not fledged or learned to fly, they will be left behind. During migration and while on the wintering grounds, the family is sometimes joined by other offspring from the previous breeding sessions to form a larger group or a flock. Young swans will usually find a mate when 2 to 3 years old and will reach sexual maturity at 3 to 4 years old. Any non-breeding swans will form loose flocks away from the nests of the breeding swans. Okay, so conservation efforts. Tundra swans are not threatened or endangered or anything like that. There is some limited hunting allowed, mostly in North Dakota, and they do allow hunting. So what we do with the Fish and Wildlife Services, we provide habitat for them. And here at Pea Island, you can see the habitat. It's a pond area. We have 3 brackish water impoundments of varying depths throughout the year, and they provide habitat for all sorts of migratory waterfowl. In Alligator River, we have farmers' fields that will flood after the harvest of the crops, whatever was in there, and the tundra swans and other migratory birds will go ahead and use those as foraging areas and swim in the ponds and forage in the water. We call these moist soil units, and the birds will be there from November until March. We actually have agreements with the farmers that use those fields, and they will purposely leave behind a certain percentage of the crop, depending on what crop it is, and leave that behind for foraging for the migratory birds. Okay, so that's all I have from my presentation. Is there any questions about tundra swans?
This is Vicki, and I have a question. When Brianna and I went to see the swans last year, I think the thing that was most fascinating to me, and I don't understand how they don't wreck into each other, but Brianna coined the term swanado. So they just swarm, and then a few of them peel off and they come down to the ground. How do they know, you know, where to land and not be landing on top of one another? And it was just fascinating.
Well, they are very big birds, but as with most birds, even small birds, they rarely do run into each other. So I'm not quite sure exactly how to do it. Maybe it's the same as when we're walking. We're not always bumping into other people in a crowd. We do keep our distance away. So I'm not sure what it is. They don't have radar, I'm sure, but maybe it is just their vision or whatever, and they do keep their distance from each other. You don't see a lot of them bumping into each other and crashing to the ground. So
it was amazing.
Yeah.
Can't reiterate more what Brianna said. If someone has not gone down there, yeah, it's a long drive from here where we live.
Yeah.
But it is just magical. It really is magical to go see them.
Yep, they are very graceful in flight too. They're so big, and you do wonder how they don't just crash into each other. But
amen.
But, yeah, it is a sight to see. Is there any other questions?
There are a few questions. Oh, sorry. There are a few questions in the chat too. I'll go ahead and let whoever was about to speak go ahead and ask their question, but we do have a few in there.
Okay.
Okay, Stephen, it's Wilson Laney. So while you were gone, one of the folks on the webinar here asked about mute swans, and I was telling them that my understanding is that they've been declared an injurious or undesirable species now, and they were saying that there was an area, I think it was in Chesapeake Bay, where the service went in and eradicated a bunch of mute swans. Can you elaborate on that for us, any at all?
Unfortunately, I cannot. I have not heard anything about that. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It just means I'm not aware of it. Mute swans are a little bit bigger than the Tundra swans, and being that big, I'm sure if they were doing some damage, they could do a lot of damage to a habitat if they're not naturally in that habitat. But unfortunately, I don't have any information on that. I can go ahead and try and look that up and find out for you later, but I don't have any information on that.
Okay, so the first question in the chat is there an ongoing effort to maintain purity in the various swans?
They really don't mate. They don't interbreed. They really do stay separate from each other. They don't even different flocks. When I showed the different groups in the migration slide, they don't really. The groups don't intermix very much. One group that goes to one area will stay as a flock, a family group, or whatever. And there's not a lot of intermixing between the groups, even within the same species of tundra swans. So I don't know of any specific efforts to maintain purity, but I don't think there's a lot of interbreeding with the other swans either.
Okay, the next question is, how is the swan population changing over time?
It's actually a very strong population. It was declining several years ago because of overhunting and things like that, but it has rebounded well, and they actually do allow some hunting because the health of the populations, both the eastern population and the western population, are both doing very well. So they do allow limited hunting, mostly in North Dakota, Minnesota area like that. But yeah, the health of the populations is very good right now.
And here in North Carolina, they allow hunting as well, don't they? But it's by lottery.
I don't know that they do allow that. I know it's by lottery in North Dakota. They don't allow a lot of licenses, and not a lot of them are taken. But I haven't heard of any hunting here in North Carolina.
That is correct. There is a swan hunt by lottery in North Carolina. I believe it's run by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission.
Okay.
Bill, did you have a question?
Anytime. No, this
I think he was asking about captive breeding, Stephen.
We don't do any captive breeding that I know of. We certainly don't do any down here in Alligator River or Pea Island. So they may do some up in Alaska. I doubt it because the populations are very strong. So I don't think it's necessary, but I'm not aware of any captive breeding programs for them. Is there any other questions?
Someone did ask where are some good places to view the swans. There are many closed roads and closed viewing platforms, especially around Pungo Lake.
Okay, Pea Island has wonderful access to view the tundra swans. You can get very, very close to them, almost to the point where you're actually chasing them away. You're so close to them. Alligator River also has our scenic drive that you can drive and view tundra swans. They're sometimes a little bit further away, but there's a lot of them there also. Unfortunately, most of them have already left for the year this year. I was out on the refuges the other day and there was a significant number had already left. So to see the swans, you want to get here in late November, December, and January is the best times to see them. Pea Island has just a slew of tundra swans there. You can see a bunch of other migratory birds also. And Alligator River also has a lot of tundra swans. If you want to take a long trip, Matamesquite, a National Wildlife Refuge, also gets a lot of tundra swans there also.
And my personal suggestion, if you want to go see the swans, it is best to book early because duck hunting season is during that time as well. So we ran into this last year with January being completely booked up on places to stay because of duck hunting season. So that's just something to be aware of if you do want to go down to the Matamesquite area to see the swans. We were able to go the first week of February last year, the first weekend, and like Vicki said earlier, we saw swan nados, so we saw plenty of swans. All right, did anyone else have any questions? If not, thank you so much for doing this presentation for us. We really appreciate it, and I hope everybody learned something new tonight. Thank you all for being here and supporting the Union County Wildlife Chapter.
Okay, thank you all for listening.
All right, good night.